we're going to tie a simple bucktail jig. This is probably the most basic jig that money can buy. It'll catch just about anything that swims, but it's used mostly for walleye. And I'm using a flathead jig. The first jig that we're going to tie is a bucktail jig. It's a very simple jig and used predominantly for walleye and bass. This happens to be about 3/8 ounce. The first thing that I'm going to do is take my flathead jig and establish it in the jaws of the vise firmly. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to establish my thread. I'm using a pretty good size, strong thread. It's about a 3/0 thread. I wrap the thread over itself continually onto the collar of the jig. And then I take my scissors and remove the tag. Once my thread is established, it's just a matter of taking a piece of bucktail and sizing it according to the jig. And then once I size it, I can cut that particular piece of bucktail. Taking a sharp pair of scissors, I'm going to cut that bucktail exactly where I think it should be cut, keeping it flat and getting it ready to apply to the collar of the jig by wrapping the thread over the section. I didn't try to put all the bucktail hair on at once. Making a jig is building this jig in components. I'm taking my second piece of bucktail hair and tying it in directly next to the first piece of bucktail hair. This makes for a sturdy jig. I'm going to take a contrasting piece of yellow bucktail and cut it and apply it to the bottom of the jig so as to give this jig a two-tone effect. Again, you're only building small pieces into the jig head at a time. Try not to use too much material at once. A piece of yellow bucktail will be added in place. Again, building this jig in components will make for a much sturdier, better looking tie. Once that final fourth layer is in place, I can continue to wrap thread one strand at a time, making a nice, neat head. If you have a sufficient amount of thread built up to form a neat collar and a very sturdy jig, it's just a matter of applying a finishing knot, and we call this a whip finish. I like to whip finish by hand, and it's just a matter of taking the thread and again wrapping over itself about 5 times. Whip finish knot is complete. It's just a matter of cutting the thread close to the collar with my scissors, and then the final stage is to apply some clear lacquer to the whole head itself. And I'm using a very, very strong clear nail polish. That clear lacquer is going to seal the deal. And that concludes our bucktail jig, our flathead two-tone bucktail jig. This is a nice orange and yellow pattern that is perfectly suited for stained water. You'll notice that this is a very sparse tie. Sparse ties have a lot more action than usual store-bought jigs, which are tied too full to fulfill the needs of the fishermen rather than the fish. There, and we just concluded tying our basic bucktail jig. This is the first jig in a series. After you've mastered this jig, you're ready to go on to the next level and tie maybe some more intricate patterns with varying types of materials. But this is really a good one to start out with. Thanks for being here.